Hello and welcome. My name's Jonathan Davey and I'm a tour guide. For the next 55 minutes, I'm going to accompany you on a tour around Worcester on behalf of the Gallipoli Association. The way we're going to do this is, first of all, I'm going to explain how the tour works. Then we'll briefly have overviews of both the city of Worcester and the campaign that was fought in the Dardanelles in 1915. We'll then attempt to link up those two subjects as we make our tour of Worcester, which will form the body of this talk. And finally, at the end, I'll give you some further information in case you're interested in taking this study any further. The origins for this tour came about in a similar tour that I've arranged in the town of Warwick a few months ago. This originally was going to be a guided walk around the town. However, the realities of the COVID-19 restrictions meant that the walk had to be cancelled. Ian Binney came up with the idea that we should do a virtual tour, and so that's what we've come up with. It worked out all right for Warwick, and so we're doing the same thing again for Worcester. The basic idea of a virtual tour is effectively it's just a multimedia presentation. We're going to be using some maps that people who lived in the First World War would recognise of Worcester. However, we're going to combine that with some modern Google Earth imagery so you can see what it looks like today. We'll also be using some photographs, both then and now, and we're lucky enough to have presentations by 4 local historians who will put some more meat on the bones of the story. Naturally, there are pros and cons of doing this kind of tour. The first con is obviously that we're not in Worcester. We don't get the feeling of the place as we're walking around it. However, we also can extend the range of places that we visit without walking the legs off people. We can also reach far more people. You don't have to be in Worcester, so it's easier to engage with people further away. And finally, hopefully it makes a more logical flow in that we can remain talking on one subject whilst moving around the city rather than moving between subjects as we do so. Right, well, now let's start with an introduction to the city of Worcester itself. The modern city of Worcester is a non-metropolitan centre with about 100,000 people, and it lies in the west of the Midlands in England. It's approximately 100 miles northwest of London and 30 miles southwest of Birmingham. The reason for Worcester's importance as a city is the River Severn, which flows north-south across the western edge of the centre, and its proximity to the Icknield Way, a Neolithic road which ran from south to north in this part of the world. It was also a crossing across the River Severn and provided access down the road to London. The Romans established a base at Worcester, and this was for virtually the same size in the medieval ages when a cathedral and castle were established there. In the 18th century, the canals arrived, in the 19th, the railways, and in the 20th, the roads, with the M5 to the east and the A449 to the north. The city started to expand and take in other centres, villages, such as St John's to the west, Barben to the north, Spring Hill to the east, and Redhill along the London Road. Later, developments such as St Peter's, Lower Wick, Henwick, Northwick, Claines, and places that were just villages or estates such as Blackpole or Leopard Grange have become part of the urban sprawl. Zooming in to the older part of the city, we can trace its development. From the medieval ring road, the medieval walls which now form the ring road, the industrial area of Diglis, and then Spring Hill and Fort Royal, which was an important part of the Civil War in 1651. So by the end of the 18th century, this was the limit of Worcester. During the 19th century, it expanded further with cricket ground, racecourse, and 2 railway stations. And by the time of the First World War, it expanded further still. So this is the Worcester that the people that we're going to be considering would have known. And we can look at a contemporary map which reflects that, with the cathedral at the bottom, the mass of the railway junction out to the east. We're now going to zoom in to where we're going to start our tour of Worcester. And this is to the Guildhall on a high street. A rather wonderful example of a Queen Anne building. It was constructed in 1723, and we are now lucky enough to have a presentation by local historian Robbie Porter, who's going to explain its significance to the First World War.
I'm Robbie Porter, local Worcester historian. I've lived in the city for 30 years and I've always taken a keen interest in its history. I'd like to welcome you today to Worcester's magnificent Guildhall. In August 1914, it doubled as a recruitment station. Hundreds of men walked through these doors at Worcester Guildhall to line up here in front of the recruitment sergeants' desks. They were signing up for a conflict they thought would be over by Christmas. Unfortunately, that wasn't how it played out. It's hard for us today to get a flavour of the patriotic fervour and excitement that accompanied the declaration of war in August 1914. In those early days, weeks and months, hundreds of men made the trip from home, a lot of them with pals and family, here to Worcester Guildhall, which doubled as the city's largest recruitment station. And they're commemorated here today. All of those men who signed on the dotted line are commemorated today in Worcester Guildhall. Behind two sets of screens, the name of every man who signed up to fight is commemorated. Let's have a look at them. Next to the names of some of these men, a significant proportion of them in fact, are small crosses, small golden crosses, and those represent the men who never came back, the men who fell on the battlefields of France, Flanders, Gallipoli. The battalions of the Worcestershire Regiment fought in all the theatres of operations. But all of these men, everyone who signed up, is commemorated here to this day behind these magnificent screens in Worcester's Guildhall. By 1915, the situation was desperate. Stalemate had developed on the Western Front. Now, at the same time, the Commander-in-Chief of the Imperial Russian Army, the Grand Duke Nicholas Nikolaevich, had written to the British government asking for war material and grain to be provided to the Russian Empire. Churchill realised that the pressure on the Russians on the Eastern Front could be alleviated if the Straits had been forced and the Ottoman Empire knocked out of the war. And Churchill and Fisher, between them, persuaded the War Cabinet that the Dardanelles campaign was the way of doing it, the crucial offensive action that would deploy the Royal Navy in the role for which it had been designed and force the Ottoman Empire out of the war. In addition to getting grain on Russian tables and war supplies to Russia, German troops would have been pulled away from the Western Front and to be redeployed to the Eastern Front. This would have broken the stalemate on the Western Front and given an opportunity to the Western Allies to effect a crucial breakthrough. The strategic vision set out by Fisher and Churchill did not envisage amphibious landings. The Straits would be forced entirely by naval action. The 23 pre-dreadnought battleships due to be scrapped would force the Straits. Their gunnery was outdated, their guns didn't have the range, the Tucker's shore defences were too well prepared, the minefields proved lethal, and several capital ships were actually sunk trying to force the Straits. A new plan had to be conceived, and conceived quickly, and this involved amphibious landings on the peninsula.
Robbie, thank you very much for that, and I really do recommend the Guildhall's a place to visit if you are ever in Worcester. We're now going to leave the Guildhall, turn left, and walk up High Street, which is along the old Icknield Way and forms the real backbone of the city of Worcester. Heading north, we soon come to the Cross. This has been an important part of Worcester's urban landscape for many centuries. Indeed, in the medieval period, there was a cross here, and it was a place where kings and queens were welcomed to the city. In 1730, the magnificent Church of St Nicholas was built by Thomas White, a pupil of Sir Christopher Wren. Carry on north, the cross becomes Foregate Street, another of Worcester's main shopping streets. In 1860, Foregate Street station was built here, with a viaduct spanning the road. We're going to pass underneath the viaduct, and just to the north, we'll stop outside a large Victorian building. We're now going to backtrack and see what this journey looks like today. As we head north, many of these elegant medieval and Georgian buildings contain some of Worcester's main shoppers, although, like many towns and cities, the High Street is suffering greatly. Perhaps emblematic of that is the fact that St Nicholas Church is now a cafe. As we carry on north past Foregate Street Station, we're going to stop outside a large Victorian building. Constructed in 1896, this was founded for the Worcestershire Natural History Society. Since then, it has become the Worcester City Art Gallery and Museum, and is another must-see place in a tour of Worcester. In here, we're going to have a presentation from Dr. John Paddock about the Worcestershire Regiment.
My name's John Paddock. I'm the curator of the Worcestershire Regiment Museum's Worcestershire, which is the home of the old Worcester Regiment collection. We're stood in the Worcester City Museum and Art Gallery, and in particular in the Worcestershire Soldier Gallery, which is the home of the Worcestershire Regiment collection and the Worcestershire Yeomanry collection. And I'm stood in front of our reconstruction of a soldier of the 9th Worcesters in a trench at Gallipoli. Now, the Worcestershire Regiment furnished two battalions to serve in the campaign. Initially, the 4th Worcesters formed part of 29th Division, in fact, 88th Brigade, and they took part in the initial landings on the 25th of April 1915 at Helles. The 4th Battalion were a regular battalion. I mean, the Worcesters, pre-war, the Worcesters were one of the few county regiments to actually have 4 battalions. So it was a regular battalion, alternated service in this country and overseas, composed principally of working class lads, either from the urban areas of Worcestershire, so Dudley, Worcester itself, parts of Birmingham, or from the rural poor. Officered for the most part by the landed gentry, educated middle class officers, lawyers, etc., etc. So in the early hours, the Worcesters approached the beaches, approached V Beach. They then transferred to the Clyde. As they cleared the bridge, they discovered that they were almost entirely on their own. The beach was littered with barbed wire entanglements, dead and dying soldiers, and Carr took the view that he was sustaining too many heavy casualties and retired to the Clyde. Meanwhile, the rest of the battalion, under Colonel Cayley, had been transshipped into tow ships and initially had approached V Beach, but it was very clear that the beach was untenable, and so they were transferred onto W Beach. And the first platoons landed on the beach at 12 o'clock, some 5 hours after the initial transshipment. Now, as soon as they arrived on the beach and they assembled the battalion, Colonel Cayley was ordered to take the heights above the beach. The Hill 138 at the top of the cliffs was surmounted by a Turkish redoubt. Company by company, the battalion assaulted the cliffs, climbed the cliffs, and then found themselves faced by an impenetrable barbed wire entanglement. So officers called for volunteers and they approached the entanglements. And at that point, they were subjected to sustained rifle and machine gun fire. And one by one, as they climbed under the barbed wire to cut the entanglements, the volunteers were individually shot down and more volunteers had to replace them. But eventually by 2 o'clock, they'd cut routes through the barbed wire and the battalion was able to move forward. Having succeeded in Hill 138, they then moved forward over the next rise, only to be faced by a similar redoubt, and it took another hour or so to cut through that entanglement. So by nightfall, the battalion had established itself below this redoubt and they were able to bring up their machine guns. But at that point, the assault on Krithia had come to a halt. It is during the lull in the fighting in early July, in fact on the 3rd of July, that the regiment won its first VC. This was awarded to Lieutenant James, who led a bombing party against the Turkish trench. Having cleared part of the trench, they came to the first salient and then were thrown back by a counter-attack. And James, having lost most of his platoon, retired with his corporal, fortified a position with sandbags and dead bodies, and armed with 2 rifles and a series of jam-jar bombs, held the position while his corporal ran back to the Allied lines to gain support. And as a result, James was awarded a VC. During the assaults in April and May, most of the regular officers and NCOs of the regiment and many of the professional soldiers, the old soldiers, were casualties in one form or another. And the regiment had reduced in effective strength from somewhere around 800 at the point of landing, now to somewhere in the region of 400 to 500 men and officers. By the 28th, 29th of July, the 4th Worcesters were pulled back into reserve, brought up to strength, and were preparing for another assault on Krithia. And this assault became known as the Battle of Krithia Vineyard. On the 6th of August 1915, the regiment left the trenches, left the assault trenches at 1550. And the advance went reasonably successfully until they met the first rise in the land. And as they went over the first ridge, they were enfiladed by Turkish machine gun fire and rifle fire, and wave after wave of men fell. The assault petered out and the battalion retired, having lost casualties of 16 officers and 752 men. So it's during this rebuilding in sort of the end of August, beginning of September, the battlefield casualties started to arrive, amongst whom was Privates Fred Dancox and Private Cyril Love. Both of them lived in Worcester, but Cyril Love is quite poignant in terms that Cyril was a local Worcester boy, the son of James and Alice Love of Lansdowne Road, Worcester. He was educated at St Martin's School, and before the war, he'd been a tinsmith with Messrs Williams and Sons. At the beginning of 1915, he joined the 12th Battalion, and following basic training, he was posted to the 4th, arriving in Gallipoli, on the Gallipoli Peninsula, on the 10th of September 1915. A month and a half, Cyril had received wounds from which he died. He died at the age of 20, in fact, 3 or 4 days after his 20th birthday, of wounds received on the 29th of November 1915. So his war was less than a month and a half.
I'm going to butt in at this stage and take us on a quick diversion to go and see Cyril's family home. You can follow on the map or the video, and we're going to come out of the museum, turn east along Taylor's Lane, turn left again, north into Sansom Walk, past St Mary Magdalene's Church, up Chestnut Walk, Tennis Walk, and then finally turn right into start of Lansdowne Road. Cyril lived just on the right here. This was not a well-to-do part of town. The houses along here were all Victorian 2-ups, 2-downs, but Cyril's house was at the fourth one in from the end that we can see here. Let's now look in a little bit more detail about Cyril Love's final resting place. By this stage, the 4th Worcesters had been removed from Helles and were holding the Suvla Bayfront, which is where he was wounded and died. He's buried in the Hill 10 Commonwealth War Graves Committee Cemetery, just inland from the bay. And we've got a couple of views of it here. But we can do better than that. If we look at the committee's website, we can interrogate the cemetery plan and find out that Cyril Love was buried in plot 5, row B, grave 8. And you can see that here. We've also, using Google Maps, you can actually see his very grave. So we're now paying respects to Cyril Love without actually going there. I'll now hand you back to John Paddock, who's going.
Friend Adcox, who I mentioned earlier, went on to win a VC at Pol Capel with the 4th Battalion in 1917. We hold Fred Dancox's medals, but again, he's another one who sadly never returned from the war.
And as we did with Cyril Love, we're going to do with Fred Dancox. So we're going to come out of the City Museum, turn around this time down to the south to go past Foregate Street. But before we get to the cross, we're going to turn right down the Butts. And this was just inside the medieval city wall. We're going down to head towards the river. And this was, again, a very poor part of town, down by the cattle market. And we're going to go onto a street called Dolday. Some of the poorest housing in Worcester was found on Dolday, especially courts, tenements built around a central court which contained the pump and the one privy. In the 50s and 60s, these were all cleared, and Dolday these days is unrecognisable. It's now a rather soulless bit of dual carriageway that acts as an island. Most people wouldn't even be aware that this was where a Victoria Cross winner lived.
As a result of the Allies' failure to make progress at Gallipoli, reinforcements were dispatched, including 13th Division, which included the 9th Worcesters. Now, the 9th Worcesters had spent 1915, or the beginning of 1915, training in England for the expedition, and they arrived on the peninsula on the 13th of July, 1915. Initially, they landed at the Helles beach and took the position of the 4th Worcesters in the frontline trenches. The 9th Battalion was raised specifically for the war. Its members, again, it's other ranks mostly drawn from the rural and working class poor, although a number of middle class lads joined as private soldiers. It was officered for the most part by the educated middle classes, from OTCs, from universities, teachers and that sort of thing. A good example of this type of officer was Lieutenant Charles James Tree of Lansdowne Crescent, Worcester. But he'd been born in Malvern Link, moved on to Charterhouse, ultimately to Pembroke College, Cambridge, where he graduated with honours, and latterly became a teacher. At the outbreak of the war, he volunteered for the army and joined the 9th Battalion. He left England with the rest of the 9th Battalion in June 1915 and arrived at Gallipoli on the 13th of July. Of Lee, his company commander said, "On the night of the 17th, Lieutenant Tree was with his platoon in a part of the line where the enemy were only 60 yards away. In the middle of the night, the Turks set fire to our barricades in front of our trench, and Lieutenant Tree received a bayonet wound while supervising the defence of the most critical point in the trench. He was so brave about it, he pretended it was only a scratch and was only taken away on a stretcher when things were going all right. He was brought down to the sea the day before yesterday, and he died last night on a hospital ship. The day before he was wounded, he repaired a parapet with some of his platoon under heavy fire, with the coolness of a seasoned soldier. The men of his platoon would do anything for him. Among the officers, he was recognised as the ablest of the subalterns, and he was most certainly the most popular. He was 25 years of age, unmarried, and he'd been at the front for less than a week. Tree was buried at the Lancashire Landing Cemetery in Gallipoli.
And for the third time today, we're going to leave the City Art Gallery Museum and go and find the Tree family home. Again, we're going to head south down past Foregate Street, but instead of turning right into the Butts, we're going to walk left down Sansom Way, past St George's Roman Catholic Church, onto Lowesmoor, then into the industrial areas of over the canal, under the railway line, then up Rainbow Hill, up to the rather more exclusive houses of Lansdowne Crescent.
The 9th Battalion disembarked on Helles on the 13th of July, and following a period of acclimatation and reserve trenches, moved forward to take the place of the 4th Battalion, who were recovering from their defeat at Krithia Vineyard. And it was during these actions that Lieutenant Tree was killed. They were then withdrawn from the line and transshipped to Anzac Beach in preparation for assault on Sarry Bear. The beginning of this assault took place on the 6th of August 1915. Now, Sarry Bear is a feature, a mountainous feature rising 1,000 feet above the beaches, and because of the failure to take Krithia, it was seen that there should be an attempt to move the Turks on the other side of the peninsula. No one had anticipated the difficulties of a night assault up these precipitous ridges. The 9th Battalion were held up behind an Indian brigade, which failed to move forward at the expected time, and therefore were exposed to daylight and enemy fire when they began their ascent. The original planned route was found to be untenable, and for the next 4 days, the regiment, the battalion, took part in a series of assaults and counter-assaults, which resulted on the 10th of August with the death of Colonel Nunn and the second in command, Major Boyd Moss. And during this whole assault, the regiment lost 268 men killed, 688 men in total were casualties, and 24 officers. And the regiment was left with an operational strength of 1 officer, unwounded, and 150 men. And after 4 days of confused fighting, the battalion retired back to the beaches.
Thank you very much to John Paddock for telling us so much about the 4th and 9th Worcesters. We haven't quite finished with the Worcestershire Regiment yet. We're going to move rather further afield now From Worcester, we're going to go 16 miles east-southeast to the village of Harvington, just by Evesham. And local historian Alan Stevens is going to give us the tragic story of what happened to some of the men from Harvington.
Hello, my name is Alan Stevens. For the first 27 years of my life, I lived and worked in the neighbouring parish of Norton near Evesham before moving to Harvington when I got married, and I've lived here ever since. My interests are research in the family tree and local history. I feel at this point I ought to say thank you to Julian Rawls of this parish, whose work on creating the Harvington History website was a great help in sourcing the village photographs of this period. And it was while sitting in the church one day that my eyes were drawn to the war memorial on the wall with its photographs of the fallen. And it occurred to me that although there were names and faces, there were no other details, such as what regiments they were in or where they served. Harvington in 1914 was a village of just under 900 souls. 20 men from Harvington died in the war, which is 18.5% of that age group. And given that there must have been others with life-changing injuries, this explains the massive impact that war had on that generation. Of the 20 that died, 4 were killed or died of wounds at Gallipoli. Frank Felix Cook was the son of John and Annie Cook, who ran the local post office, which at the time stood near the junction of Village Street and where Ragley Road now is. In 1911 census, his occupation is described as a clerk. He enlisted at the beginning of 1914, and he's also the brother-in-law of Walter Hancock. Walter Joseph Hancock lived at Yew Tree Cottage, Grange Lane, Harvington, and was the son of Thomas and Elizabeth Hancock. He also enlisted at the beginning of September 1914. Walter Thomas Marsh was the son of Herbert and Agnes Marsh. Herbert had died in 1904, and Agnes was living at Leicester Gables, Village Street, Harvington, which is almost opposite the Baptist Chapel. William is recorded in the 1911 census as living and working as a chef in Derby. These 3 men joined the 9th Worcesters. They sailed from Avonmouth on the 20th of June 1915. They landed at V Beach at the edge of the peninsula and marched around the coast to Gully Beach, where they held the line until withdrawn on the 29th of July. On the evening of the 3rd of August, they landed at Anzac Cove, where a New Zealand guide took them to their positions at a place called, rather inappropriately, Rest Gully, where, despite the flies, heat, and occasional shellfire, they had to remain inconspicuous for 2 days. The attack began at 20:30 hours on the 6th of August and continued for about 5 days. It was a complete failure. So badly mauled were the 9th Worcestershires that they were temporarily amalgamated with the 7th Gloucestershires. Frank Cook was posted missing on the 9th of August, and on the 16th of October his parents received a letter saying that it was assumed that he'd been killed on that day. He was 23. Walter Hancock is recorded as dying of wounds on the 10th of August. His last letter home mentions that it is very hot and the routine is to spend 4 days in the trench where we get very little sleep and then have some rest, and we need it. We are in sight of Ashi Baba, about 3 miles away. He was 26. William Marsh is also recorded as dying of wounds on the 10th of August. He was 28. All 3 men are commemorated on the Hellas Memorial. The 4th Harvington man was Alfred Ludlow. Alfred was the son of Charles and Elizabeth Ludlow. In 1897 he married Annie Andrews. The 1911 census records him as living in the Croft, Grange Lane, Harvington, and working as a general carrier and market gardener. The couple had 4 children. He joined the army on the 2nd of January 1915 and was also in the 9th Worcesters. He arrived at Suvla Bay, 27th of October, by which time the weather was turning from the blistering heat of summer to snow and sharp frosts of winter. Alfred is recorded as being wounded in the head in the early hours of the 9th of January 1916. That is, at the last moment of the Gallipoli campaign. He was evacuated to Malta and then to a hospital in Manchester, where he was judged unfit for further military service, and was discharged from the army on the 9th of August 1916, arriving home on the 12th of August. Contemporary reports suggest that Alfred was enfeebled and his health was permanently affected. He received unremitting care from his wife, which preserved his life, but in January 1924 he suffered a stroke from which he never recovered. He died February the 12th, 1924, aged 47. Although this was over 5 years after the end of the war, his name is included on the Harvington War Memorial, so it must have been felt at the time that he is one of the village war dead. Also on the memorial are the names of two of his brothers who were killed in France, Jesse in November 1916 and Howard in May 1917, and that of William Hancock, brother of Walter, who died of meningitis whilst in the army in March 1917.
Alan, thank you very much for describing how the men of Worcestershire who lived in Harvington suffered so grievously in Gallipoli. We're now going to use the magic of Google Maps to get ourselves straight back to the museum. We're now going to look at a different organisation that fought at Gallipoli that came from Worcestershire. Now that we have magicked our way back to the museum, we're now going to head off north, and right next door to the City Art Gallery and Museum is Shai Hall, a very impressive 1835 classical building that held the county's court and administrative centre until it was moved in the 1970s. We're then going to turn left down Castle Street and go past what was the old infirmary and is now part of the University of Worcester, and come up to the southern end of Worcester Racecourse. I'll now hand over to Stamford Cartwright, who is going to explain to us why we're here.
I'm Colonel Stamford Cartwright. I curate the collection of the Worcestershire Yeomanry, the Queen's Own Worcestershire Hussars, which is located in the City Museum and Art Gallery. I'm stood here at the gates of Pitchcroft, which is now the home of the Worcestershire Racecourse. It was given in perpetuity by the City Fathers to the Worcestershire Yeomanry to act as a parade ground to enable them to enhance their skills in horsemanship and parading. But perhaps we should first look back at the when and why the yeomanry were formed in the very latter part of the 18th century. In the 1790s, Napoleon Bonaparte was stamping around Europe, and it was considered by the central government that a force should be recruited to defend the shores of Great Britain. And in October 1794, the first troop of Worcestershire Yeomanry Cavalry paraded for the first time. The first campaign that the regiment were involved in was the war in South Africa in 1900. Skipping forward now and again to the Great War, first of all, when the regiment were mobilised, they were sent to Cirencester to enhance their horsemanship, and then on to Bury St Edmunds. In 1915, the regiment was sent to Egypt, but just a few months later, they were then sent to the Gallipoli Peninsula in Turkey, They were to take part in the attack across the Salt Plain, which led to Chocolate Hill, Dead Man's Gully, Scimitar Hill and Green Hill. When the South Midland Brigade were marching across the Salt Lake, the regiments that took part in it were decimated. And it was only the fact that one of the officers of the squadron suggested that the troops should be at least 100 yards apart that saved so many of the Worcestershire yeomen. Eventually, they were to find some cover on the slopes of Chocolate Hill. Later, General Sir Ian Hamilton, the commander at the time, said the advance of those English yeomen was a sight to send a thrill of pride through anyone with a drop of English blood running in their veins. We're now going to leave Pitchcroft and visit the homes of two typical yeoman soldiers.
As Stamford has said, we're now going to be leaving the vicinity of Worcester, and we're going to be going quite a long way to the north, so presumably out the map a fair distance. Pitchcroft is right down at the bottom. We're going to be heading north up Easy Row, making a right turn onto the east along Moore Street, and then turning left to rejoin the main road running north out of Worcester, Icknield Way, although it now has the more prosaic title of the A449. We're not going to go far. We're going to stop at a park halfway up, and if you'll let me go back to the Worcester Regiment rather than Yeomanry, this is Galuvelt Park, which celebrates an action by the 2nd Battalion of the Worcester Regiment at the First Battle of Ypres in October 1914. A spirited counterattack after the Germans had broke through the lines by the 2nd Worcesters arguably saved the city from defeat, and also the BEF. But we're now going to go back to the Yeomanry and carry on up north towards a village called Claines. And before we get to the village, we're going to branch off to the left to Oak Farm, which is where Stamford Cartwright is going to pick up the story of the Worcestershire Yeoman.
So here we are at Oak Farm, Claines, the home where a gentleman called Harry Sansom was born. In 1911, he decided at the age of 18 to enlist in the Yeomanry. Now, we heard earlier about the Yeomanry itself, and Harry enlisted in Worcester and became a member of D Squadron. Through a succession of training and summer camps, Harry became quite a proficient soldier and indeed a proficient horseman. He was to take part in the salt flats to the rear of Suvla Bay. But for Harry, he was wounded in the back on Chocolate Hill. He was later evacuated from the peninsula and eventually returned to Worcester, where in some months later he was released from his 4-year contract with the Yeomanry, and he retired from service with exemplary service but as medically unfit. By then Harry had become a corporal. He returned to Claines, to his home, and carried on his occupation as a farmer.
Leaving Harry Sansom in Claines, we're now going to retrace our steps right back to where we started and go past the centre of the city and further south. Heading south, past the centre of the city, where you enter the industrial area of Diglis on banks of the Severn, and Stamford Cartwright resumes his story about the yeomanry.
I'm standing here at Diglis Loch. This is the entrance from the River Severn to the Worcester-Birmingham Canal. Behind me, you can see the lockkeeper's cottage. In the 1900s, this was the family home of the Wilmots. Charles and Mary Wilmot had 4 sons, all of which fought in the Great War. 3 of the sons actually served in the Worcestershire Yeomanry, the Queen's Own Worcestershire Hussars. The eldest brother, Evelyn, had served from 1900 with the Territorial Force and then transferred to the Yeomanry in 1908. At the time of mobilisation, his appointment was a regimental quartermaster sergeant. And it was in that position that in 1915 he went with the regiment to Egypt and then on to Gallipoli. He developed sickness in Gallipoli and was invalided out to Mudros and then back to the United Kingdom, where he gained strength and was then moved back to the regiment in August 1916, when he took over the role as quartermaster, having been commissioned in the rank of lieutenant. He was taking over the job from Quartermaster Bell, who had been captured at Katia and was then in a prisoner of war camp in Turkey. Evelyn's 3 brothers, as I say, 2 of which served with the Yeomanry, 1 of which served with the Fusiliers and won a military medal. The other 2 brothers, one was in Gallipoli, the other one joined later, having transferred from the Royal Gloucestershire Hussars. And they all stayed with the regiment except the one that was a prisoner after Katia until the end of the war. Evelyn continued his service with the regiment and didn't finally retire until 1937, when, because of age, he was asked to leave. He still kept contact with the regiment throughout much of the rest of his life.
Stanford, thank you very much. We're now going to leave the Yeoman and return to the city centre, this time to the magnificent cathedral right in the city centre. There's been a cathedral on this site since the year 680. However, the present cathedral was built between 1084 and 1504. And it represents every style of English architecture from Norman to Perpendicular Gothic. It also contains the tomb of King John. As we come to the end of the tour, we're going to circumnavigate the cathedral. We're going to come along to the river, turn north up that, and then take what would have been medieval streets as we come round to the north side of the cathedral. As we do that, using Google Earth, we come to yet another part of the city that has changed beyond all recognition. And this is Dean's Way, and it comes down towards the north side of the cathedral and the War Memorial, where Stamford Cartwright is going to return to talk to us.
I'm stood here at the base of the County War Memorial in the grounds of Worcester Cathedral. This memorial was erected in the early 1920s following the erection of a temporary memorial erected very shortly after the end of the Great War. When you look at the memorial, and we've chosen this side, you'll see the 3 badges of the county regiments. namely the Worcestershire Regiment, and in the centre the Worcestershire Yeomanry, the Queen's Own Worcestershire Hussars, and of course the Royal Artillery to the left-hand side. This memorial was erected to recognise the sacrifice by the sons and indeed the daughters of the county men and women that gave their lives and indeed fought in what was then called the Great War, 1914 to 1919. It served as a purpose to focus the minds of those that had lost loved ones and recognises that sacrifice. Within the cathedral itself, there is St. George's Chapel, which is a military chapel dedicated to the regiments that were originally raised within the county, and be they territorial, yeomanry, or regular army, they all served during the Great War. Within the cloisters of the cathedral itself, there are a number of stained glass windows that were installed during the 1920s by the families of those that had been killed in action or subsequently died of wounds during their service. These were particularly with regards to the Gallipoli campaign. With regards to my own regiment, the Queen's Own Worcestershire Hussars, and looking at the Gallipoli campaign in particular, 3/4 of the regiment was sent to the Dardanelles, leaving just 100 souls in Egypt to look after the horses and the equipment of the regiment. They suffered greatly during those 4 months that they were in the peninsula, and fortunately few of them died within the campaign itself, but many were injured, and far more suffered from various diseases such as enteric fever, typhoid, dysentery, and which laid the whole regiment low for a long period of time. Many of them were forced to be evacuated to Mudros and then back to Egypt, and many of them then back to the UK to recover. It's interesting to question why the memorial was erected here on holy ground adjacent to Worcester Cathedral. If we look back at the way that so many people were very practicing Christians and other denominations at that time, it's no surprise that this particular place was chosen to be the memorial to those that served in the Great War, and I suppose to be a focal point, not just for the families, but for also those veterans that fought alongside their chums to come here, particularly on a Remembrance Sunday, and see the wreath laying process which still goes on to this day.
Having paid tribute to the men who served and died in Worcester in the Great War, it seems only fitting that we should go back to where we started, back up to Worcester's Guildhall. We'll pause when we get there for a moment's reflection and summarise the tour that we've just done. Well, that's the end of the tour. I hope you've enjoyed it. If you knew something about Worcester, I hope you've discovered something about the Gallipoli campaign. Likewise, if you knew Gallipoli, you've discovered a little bit about Worcester. But over the last 55 minutes, we've virtually covered a distance of 6 miles or some 10 kilometres, and that's without our jaunt down to Harvington. We've celebrated several units and their sacrifice and service. That is in particular the 4th and 9th Battalions of the Worcestershire Regiment and the 1st Worcestershire Yeomanry. The campaign that we've mainly dealt with, obviously, has been Gallipoli, which is fought from April of 1915 to January of 1916. The fighting on the Gallipoli Peninsula was undeniably awful, even compared with the terrible standards of the First World War. The conditions that the men fought in, and that they could never be clear of enemy gunfire on both sides, made sure that it was a terrible experience for everybody involved. Some battalions suffered more than others. The 4th Worcesters, for example, spent longer in the line. They were there on the terrible landing at Helles, and they stayed there for a long time. So they lost their entire battalion strength of 800 men several times over during the campaign. Not all due to enemy action, but a lot of them through disease and illness caused just by the sheer conditions of where they were living. Some, such as the 9th Worcesters, were later arrivals. They weren't such experienced troops, and they had their own terrible times. And to be brutally honest, their sacrifice and service did not materially affect the campaign. The Turkish defenders were too resolute, too well entrenched, and too well supported with artillery for the plans of the Allies to make any serious dent into the Turkish positions on the Gallipoli Peninsula. The Worcestershire Yeomen, acting as infantry, not as in their trained cavalry role, with other members of the 2nd Mounted Brigade, had a terrible time as they advanced across the flat, open salt plain towards Green Hill and Chocolate Hill. And again, they achieved very little in actually terms of pushing the Turkish defenders back. And we commemorated in particular 9 Worcestershire men, and their experiences all slightly different from those such as Private Cyril Love, who was wounded and died after 6 weeks and there is buried there, to Fred Dancox, who survived Gallipoli, went on to win a VC but then died back in Europe at Ypres, or for example Lieutenant Tree, who was a volunteer officer, joined the 9th Battalion and died in Gallipoli and was buried at Lancashire Landing Cemetery. Similarly, we've got the 4 gentlemen from Harvington, Frank Cook, William Marsh and Walter Hancock, who all died within a day of each other, again with the 9th Battalion. And also poor old Alfred Ludlow, who was wounded on the very, very last day of the Gallipoli campaign and died several years later as a result of the wounds he sustained. Along the way, we've visited several museums, the Mercian Regiment Museum in Worcestershire, and also the Worcestershire Yeomanry Museum, both of which are housed in the City Art Gallery and Museum, which I say is well worth a visit. The places that we've passed as a matter of interest are the Worcester Guildhall, village of Harvington and Claines, Galuvelt Park, and Worcester Cathedral. Of course, as Robbie Porter pointed out, men from Worcestershire served in all theatres of the First World War, not just Gallipoli, although the losses there were particularly high. And it wasn't just the men who served. There was terrible loss and suffering from those who left behind on the home front as well. I've sourced a lot of photographs from the internet for this presentation, and I've tried to give due attribution where I can. However, a lot of them are very widely distributed and it was impossible to work out copyright. However, all the images, especially from John Paddock's presentation on the Worcestershire Regiment, they do belong to the Worcestershire Regiment Museum, so please be mindful of that. And just to finish, here are some contacts for the organisations which have been so helpful in the making of this virtual tour. As I say, I hope you found this interesting. This has been a free talk, but the idea is to fundraise for the Gallipoli Association. So if you do think that the entertainment that you've had over the last 55 minutes has been worthwhile, then please do consider donating to the Gallipoli Association or any of the museums that we've featured so far.